You've got the key. How did you ever manage to... Lucifer! Let him go, Lucifer! Please, let him go! Let him go!
Let him go! Let him out! Let him out! Cheer! Lucifer!
Hello out there, all you citizens of the internet, and welcome to the wonderful Walt Disney Dome of Flat Earth Delusions. It is with great embarrassment that I come to you today to discuss one of the most ridiculous subjects that I've ever bothered to waste my time researching. But if this subject has somehow grabbed your attention, then perhaps what I'm about to say here will save you from wasting any more of your time on it. The topic I'm referring to here is, of course, the Flat Earth conspiracy theory. And this movement has been such a persistent plague against rational thinking that I've attempted to assemble what I hope is perhaps the most complete debunking video that has yet been made. We all hate long introductions, but I want to spend a few minutes here explaining the layout of this discussion first. That way you can decide for yourself which parts you want to take the time to listen to. I'm currently planning for this to be a 3-part video series. And this first installment that you're watching right now deals with nothing but the facts, provided by science and observation, which prove that the Earth is absolutely and irrefutably a spinning globe, and not a flat plane or disk. Even though I tried to make this as simple and concise as possible, there's still a ton of information here, and the Flat Earth community is constantly coming up with more and more nonsense to debunk. But if you manage to sit through this entire presentation, and you still believe the Earth is flat, please seek professional help immediately, because something is wrong with your brain. Part 2 of this series will focus on the history and the psychology of the Flat Earth and Ball Earth debate, and its deeper implications on religion and spirituality. This needs to be addressed because the Flat Earth community has attempted to censor, ignore, and rewrite more than 1,000 years of scientific discoveries that disagree with their own model, and the history that they do teach to their followers is in many cases exactly the opposite of what happened. There's also a growing body of little-known research from recent years which seems to suggest that many ancient cultures may have known about the globe several thousands of years earlier than what mainstream science has taught us. The third part of this series will take a closer look at the faces behind the Flat Earth movement and the possible hidden agendas they may be serving. Most people have figured out by now that this movement is indeed a psychological operation, involving a large number of paid shills and internet trolls, and perhaps thousands of fake sock puppet accounts. But what hasn't been discussed is the deep connections and parallels that it has with various other movements that we know have been co-opted by intelligence agencies for purposes of both social engineering and to simply make money off of gullible audiences. Many of the leaders and loudest voices in each of these movements seem to have histories of criminal activity and may have been blackmailed into promoting this disinformation campaign. Another large percentage of them are probably just well-meaning but confused truth seekers who genuinely believe the lies that they're regurgitating. While there's certainly nothing wrong with being curious and questioning things, I would advise being a bit cautious about making any close friendships with people actively involved in the Flat Earth cult, because a few earnest researchers have suggested that they could be profiling their followers in order to find gullible candidates who can then be pulled aside and basically brainwashed to serve as useful idiots for some other purpose. That may sound a bit far-fetched, but history shows us that these things have happened. Still, it seems much more likely that this whole thing is really just one big donkey show of a distraction. So the next time you find yourself getting trolled by a flat earther on social media, just send them a link to this video and then stop giving them your attention, because most of them are never going to stop arguing no matter what proof you show them. Also, feel free to upload or mirror these videos on your own channel. I can't copyright any of this material because a good portion of it is simply video captured from other people's work. But I've made a few contributions of my own here that I haven't seen anyone else bring to the table yet. So let's get this information out there before we lose more friends and family members to this mental illness known as Flat Earth. And now that we've got that out of the way, let's get this show started. The persistence of the flat Earth theory rests mainly on the fact that the Earth's curvature is incredibly hard to detect from the surface of the planet using our naked eyes. And if you insist that you can see curvature from an airplane, the flat Earth crowd will insist that your eyes are being tricked by the distorting effect of the airplane's curved windows. That excuse seems pretty weak, but we'll let them have the benefit of the doubt on that one. They also believe that satellites don't exist, and all photographs taken from space are fake paintings and CGI computer graphics. It does no good to try explaining to them that the term composite image does not mean that an image is fake, because they're willing to push this benefit of the doubt thing just as far as they can get away with it, and then some. The only other viewing option we're left with is amateur space balloon footage. Yet even from the height of most amateur balloons, there doesn't seem to be as much of a curve as most of us would expect to see. And this is further complicated by the odd fact that almost all weather balloon videos use GoPro cameras or fisheye lenses, which distort the horizon, something that all flat earthers see as evidence of a conspiracy to hide the Earth's flatness.
Then wouldn't it be fact? A flat fact?
Not quite. If a fisheye lens can make a flat surface look curved, then it can also make a curved surface look flat. And in the few pieces of footage that I can find that don't use GoPros or fisheye lenses, the curvature is clearly visible. This video was taken from an HTC phone and reached an altitude of over 106,000 feet. And throughout the whole thing, you'll notice that the horizon never bends, inverts, or distorts in any way, no matter where the camera is pointed. So we know that this is actual, legitimate curvature, and it's perfectly congruent with the degree of curvature that we should see from this altitude. But even at this height, it's still pretty subtle. Most space balloons go no higher than about 120,000 feet. But all math indicates that the Earth's curve doesn't become especially pronounced until well over 300,000 feet, which coincidentally is right about where so-called outer space actually begins. I'm not going to bother going into any complex math to demonstrate all this, because we can easily visualize it with a simple protractor. If we assume that the Earth has a circumference of about 25,000 miles, then we can just divide that by about 360 degrees, and we come up with almost 70 miles for every degree. And from that, we can see that it takes several hundred miles to generate any noticeable curvature. So from this, we can gather that flat earthers really don't comprehend the true scale of the Earth and just how large a field of view we would need in order to see the curve. All the math, all the models, every image, and every photograph that I've ever come across testifies to this. Here we have a curvature demonstration from David Ridland's YouTube channel, and right about here we can see what is roughly the height of most space balloons, which looks pretty consistent with everything I've said so far. And if we keep going, you can almost begin to see how easy it would be for someone on the ground to assume that there's no curvature. A number of flat earthers have shared space balloon footage that actually does go a bit higher than the one I just showed you. But if you pay careful attention, you'll see that they are actually distorting the curve. In this video, the horizon appears to stay flat and level, but you never get to see the camera bounce up and down. The way barrel distortion works is that it makes a horizontal line turn concave when it goes below the center of the screen, and convex when it goes above the center. As long as the camera stays centered, it looks pretty flat. But in this video, we can actually see the upturned edges that they somehow managed to ignore. Of course, anytime you bother to explain all this to a flat earther, they'll try to weasel their way out of it by either changing the subject, hurling insults, or simply lying to your face about what we can all see with our eyes. Any evidence that doesn't conform with their delusion is automatically rejected and labeled as fake, no matter how solid and irrefutable it actually is.
You know, the very powerful and the very stupid have one thing in common. They don't alter their views to fit the facts. They alter the facts to fit the views.
New category, please. Combine fact with fairy tale.
The simple fact is that regardless of how hard you seek it, you will never find evidence of one single degree of curvature on the face of the Earth.
The real fact is that curvature can be measured just about everywhere if you apply the math correctly. which flat earthers will never do. Again, I'm not going to bother going into all the boring calculations and factoring in all the countless variables involved here, because there are already tons of online calculators that can do that for you. But the main problem that the flat earthers are having here isn't really the math itself. The typical 8 inches per mile squared formula that they keep using is basically correct. The mistake they keep making is assuming that the numbers they come up with are referring to how much of a distant object should be hidden below the horizon, which is wrong. This math does not refer to your line of sight, so the fact that we can see a distant building or mountain from 200 miles away doesn't mean anything, and it does not disprove the globe. The proper, controlled way to obtain accurate measurements is to first establish a horizontal plane perpendicular to a plumb line from where you're making your observations. The easiest way to do this is with a theodolite, which is specifically designed to help geodetic surveyors measure the Earth's curvature. Most of these come with their own spirit level or auto level, which will help you aim your sights in a direction that would run perfectly parallel to the surface of the Earth, if it were flat. That is your horizontal plane. And simply by doing this, you'll see for yourself that the horizon does not come up to eye level as the flat earthers claim. And you'll see that distant buildings and ships do in fact drop below your horizontal plane as they get further away from you. This is proof of curvature. And if you refuse to follow these steps, then nothing you have to say about the shape of the Earth will ever matter because you're not actually measuring anything. Now, there are dozens of flat Earth videos where they claim to have interviewed surveyors who state that they've never had to deal with curvature. But since I happen to know a few surveyors who do deal with curvature, I was tempted to assume that these interviews were fake. However, after doing some research, I learned that many surveyors actually are pretty ignorant about the Earth's curvature. To understand why, you first need to be aware that there is a big difference between plane surveyors and geodetic surveyors. A plane surveyor can treat an area of a specified size as if it were a flat plane, usually an area of around 250 kilometers. Over these distances, the Earth's curvature is so subtle and gradual that it's almost inconsequential for most types of construction. To illustrate just how inconsequential it is, let's take a look at the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge. Its two towers are about 4,200 feet apart, and due to the curvature of the Earth, the tops of the towers are less than 2 inches wider apart than the bottoms of the towers. That's almost not even worth paying attention to. But when you start dealing with larger areas, you'll begin to accumulate some pretty considerable errors in your calculations if you don't begin taking this curvature into account. This is explicitly stated in just about every handbook and textbook dealing with surveying, radio broadcast engineering, aircraft and space vehicles, and numerous other fields. And you don't have to take any of this on faith, because you can actually go out and reproduce these measurements yourself. There are maps available for every state showing the locations of various benchmarks where measurements were taken to establish the geodetic datums and coordinate systems that the whole world uses. You can also look up the triangulation data for numerous bridges and other structures where curvature was taken into account. And in some cases, you can actually see where they compensated for it. So the curvature is out there, it is measurable, and anyone who says otherwise is either ignorant or a liar. And in case you haven't noticed by now, there are a lot of ignorant liars in the flat earth community.
You really think someone would do that? Just go on the internet and tell lies?
I'm just astounded that you would actually post on the internet such a claim that surveyors do not measure curvature, that we don't do anything with spherical trigonometry. I mean, how can you do that? What's this? The astronomic triangle. I'm just flabbergasted. I'm like, I have no words. It's just funny, really. That's why I wonder if you really do believe what you say you believe. Here's the manual on artillery surveying. You should be familiar with it. What's this? It's the spherical triangle. of the celestial sphere. What's this? From the same manual. Here he is saying surveyors never take curvature into account, yet here it is talking about UTM coordinates being projected from these spheroids. And of course, this is pre-GPS, pre-GNSS. This is back when each continent had its own spheroid to model that portion of the Earth. Of course, now we have one ellipsoid that models the entire world. But back in the day, before satellite surveying was possible, each continent was modeled for its own location. So we have the international spheroid, the Clark 1866 spheroid, the Bezel, the Clark 1880, and the Everest. And you can see where these were used around the world. And what's UTM? It's a grid of northing, easting, or Y, X values that are projected onto a mapping plane from a globe, from around Earth.
In addition to their willful refusal to use the curvature formula correctly, flat earthers love to misrepresent the globe by quote mining and twisting globe earth statements out of context. And there's probably no better example of this than the infamous pear quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson.
So you spin, when you spin pizza dough, it kind of flattens out. Yeah. It gets wider in the middle. And so Earth, throughout its life, even when it formed, it was spinning. And it got a little wider at the equator than it does at the poles. So it's not actually a sphere. It's oblate. And officially it's an oblate spheroid. That's what we call it. But not only that, it's slightly wider below the equator than above the equator.
A little chubbier.
A little chubbier.
Yeah.
Chubby's a good way. It's like pear-shaped.
Yeah.
So it turns out the pear-shapedness is bigger than the height of Mount Everest above sea level.
Now, of course, that would sound pretty ridiculous to most people, since every image of the globe that we've ever seen shows an almost perfect sphere. But if you had actually bothered to listen to the rest of the quote, you would find that the flat earthers have only made themselves look ridiculous by not paying attention.
But wait, but you got to know, let me just so you understand. We've been fed a lie our entire, I want to call it a lie. We've been fed.
It's a point of view thing, I think.
Earth has been misrepresented to us by geologists because the globes that you buy, that you rub your fingers over and you feel the Himalayas and you feel the Rocky Mountains. No, okay? These mountains are puny compared to the size of the Earth. You would not know they were there. If you were truly that size, some big cosmic giant lumbering through space, coming upon the Earth, rubbing your hand on it, the depth of your what do you call these things?
Your finger.
The fingerprint mark. The depth of that would be greater than the entire range of distance from the Marianas Trench in the bottom of the Pacific to the top of Mount Everest. Therefore, you would close your eyes, rub your finger, you would not know whether you are an ocean, valley, mountain, or hill.
Well, you might be wet or dry. You might be.
Well, by how much wet?
A little.
How? No.
Yes.
You wouldn't even notice it. You're not going to say, I got to dry my hand. The depth of the ocean doesn't measure up to the depth of your fingerprint. That's my point.
Oh.
The oceans average 12,100 feet. And in proportion to this 20-foot radius, 40-foot diameter Earth, the average depth of the oceans would come out to 3 millimeters. So this line here represents the average depth of the oceans on the Earth in comparison to the Earth. It's 12,100 feet average, which comes out to 3.4 millimeters about. And the little part that's sticking down there, that's the Marianas Trench. That's the deepest part of the oceans on the Earth. It's 36,070 feet deep, which comes out to 0.414 inches, or 10.5 millimeters. And that's the deepest the oceans are in comparison to Earth. You can see here. Okay. There's the Earth. The oceans are that deep in direct proportion.
If you could hold the Earth in your hands like this, how bumpy would it actually feel? We already saw that even our planet's biggest bumps barely register relative to Earth's size, but let's go somewhere famously flat, where relative to our size, terrain rarely gets in the way of seeing lots of the planet, the US state of Kansas. I grew up here and took this footage while driving across the state last year. You can probably see why Kansas is often called flatter than a pancake. However, although it is famously flat, Kansas is not the flattest US state. In a fantastic piece of research, Jerome Dobson and Joshua Campbell defined looks flat like this: if from a given point, any part of the terrain within the horizon rises more than 0.32 degrees up, about the height of a 30-meter hill at the horizon, a typical person would say, well, hey, that part's not flat. By cleverly applying this rule to topographical data, they were able to give every state a flatness score.
So we've been fed this misrepresentation of our own planet on the belief that, in fact, we have real surface features. But cosmically speaking, we're practically a perfect sphere.
As if that wasn't lame enough, they made an even bigger quote mining blunder with several examples just like this one, where somebody had dug up an old NASA publication about linear aircraft models and focused on a single sentence referring to a flat, non-rotating Earth. The flat earthers thought they had struck gold with this little piece of evidence, but apparently they got so excited that they failed to read the rest of the publication, which factors gravity into its calculations. Now, what's more, if we look up just about any similar publication from the same year, we'll see that they actually specify that this model works only for localized flights and short distances. They go on to mention that when you begin dealing with transglobal navigation and space vehicle re-entry, you pretty much have to use the rotating spherical Earth model. You'll find the same statement in most handbooks for radio broadcast engineers. They're allowed to use both flat Earth and round Earth methods for calculating the bearings of radio signals. But here again, they specify that the flat Earth method will accumulate large errors for distances over 500 kilometers. So for any distance longer than that, the round Earth model must be used. Right now, you're probably thinking that this debate shouldn't even exist because we can see ships going over the Earth's curvature as they sink into the horizon. And you'd be absolutely correct. But the flat earthers have attempted to sidestep this argument by invoking a long-debunked concept known as the law of perspective. This non-existent law claims that as distant objects move away towards a vanishing point, they will slowly begin to disappear from the bottom up. And they claim that this has nothing to do with curvature because you can supposedly zoom in on it with a telescope, and the hidden portions will magically reappear. The problem with this claim is that it's a complete lie, because it purposely confuses the horizon with the vanishing point, and these two things are not the same. This video demonstrates a vanishing point. What you're seeing right now is a ship that is above the horizon. It hasn't even gone below the curvature yet. But when he zooms out, we can see that the ship has shrunken into a vanishing point. As an object moves away from you, it will uniformly shrink into nothingness. And the flat earthers are correct in saying that this has nothing to do with curvature. This is exactly what the lines of perspective would dictate, and it agrees perfectly with what we observe. I have no argument with that. But notice that the bottoms and the tops of all objects are shrinking at the same rate. There's nothing here to suggest that the bottom of an object would magically cut itself off while leaving the rest of the image intact and completely undistorted. That completely breaks away from the perspective lines. And whenever we observe this happening, we find that it's simply not possible to zoom the lower part of the object back into view, because it's now behind the horizon. You can look around all you want, but you'll never find a video that contradicts this. When part of a building disappears below the horizon line, zooming in on it will make the top portions of the object larger, but it will have absolutely no effect on the bottom portions that are being obscured by the curvature. That's because cameras and telescopes cannot zoom through a bulge of land or ocean mass. According to flat Earth physics, we should be able to bring this entire building back into view, but it's just not happening. The same principle works on every other object, and here we can even see a helicopter dropping 24 feet below the horizon line, while the camera is already zoomed in. Now, if the Earth is a ball, we should be able to bring the bottoms of these objects back into view simply by moving to a higher vantage point, which would allow us to peek over the Earth's bulge. And this is exactly what we observe every time. This is from sea level. You can't see the bottom. Move up to 12 meters and it reappears. 8 times magnification, you can't see the bottom. Zoom in to 28 times magnification, and it's still hidden by the curvature. 1.5 meters at high magnification, you can't see the bottom. Move up to 12 meters at the same magnification, and the hole reappears. At sea level, we see just the top of a distant landmass. Jump up to 12 meters, and now we can see the bottom half that was obscured by the curve. So there you have it. The flat Earth law of perspective is fake, and the curvature is real.
Here, you can see the New York City skyline from 60 miles upstate in Bear Mountain.
Well, yeah, if you're looking out from the top of a mountain, of course you're going to be able to see that far. But try taking away that added altitude and watch what happens. The whole skyline disappears below the horizon, and zooming is not going to change anything. This leads a lot of people to ask why we don't see the horizon curving downward at the sides of our visual field. If we can see 100 miles of horizon from our left to our right, why does it look flat? According to the math, there should be quite a bit of curvature over 100 miles. Well, the simple answer to this is that almost every point on your visual horizon is the exact same distance away from you, because our field of view extends outward in a circle around us, not a square. That means that the horizon line is the same distance away from you at the center as it is at your periphery. And since we measure the degree of drop by how far away it is, that means that all points on your horizon have dropped by the same amount. This results in a flat, circular horizon on a ball Earth. And if you go back to our math models, you'll see that you would need to be looking at almost 1,000 miles of horizon in order to see a noticeable dip. But flat earthers unanimously claim that oceans can't dip or follow the curve of the globe because water always seeks its own level. They don't seem to understand what the word level actually means.
Okay, we have a level surface. If you look right here, here's a level surface right there. You'll notice some properties about that. So the definition of it is a curved surface that at every point is perpendicular to the local plumb line. Another way to define that level surface is also the equipotential surface. The potential of gravity is equal at every point along that line. So the big thing I want you to understand when we talk about level and everything is a level surface is curved, meaning it has the same elevation at every point. And it is perpendicular at every point to gravity. That's what a level surface is.
The fact is that there are many different water levels, and you'll just have to look into this yourself. I'm going to just show you this website, or I'm going to just show you how mean sea level was established long ago. This is an old datum called NGV 29. These are the main primary tide stations that were used to create that datum. And if you go to this website, you can go and look up in any state the tide stations. And here you will find that they all have a latitude and a longitude. And just based on everything you've seen so far, if they have latitude and longitude, that means they have a position on the face of the Earth, right? On the globe. And you can compute the arc measurement between these points. So, yeah, The water follows the curve of the Earth. It does.
Something else that needs to be taken into account when viewing curvature from long distances is atmospheric refraction. This light bending can actually cause something near the horizon to appear higher than it really is. And in some cases, it can even make something appear above the horizon when it's actually below it. The Flat Earth community has repeatedly tried to use rare observations that only occur under these specific conditions as proof that there is no curvature. And when confronted with the explanation for it, they decided to look for a way around it. They incorrectly assumed that a laser test would be adequate. While it's commendable that some of them actually went out of their way to set up these experiments, none of them would ever agree to set up the necessary controls for it, so all of their data is pretty much useless. And most of the Flat Earth laser test videos that I've watched actually seem to show some degree of curvature. Yet the numerous unqualified people performing these experiments claim that they've produced evidence that the Earth's surface is flat, convex, and even concave, depending on which model they're trying to make us believe. And each one of them claims that they've set up the experiment correctly. If we're expected to just take their word for it, we may as well conclude that the Earth is shaped like a giant space donut. They also haven't figured out yet that modern geodetic surveyors now have access to 3D laser scanning technology, which they can use with other methods to create some pretty accurate models of the local terrain. And of course, this often accounts for the Earth's curvature. Regardless of what methods are used, geodetic surveyors already have tables and formulas that they can use to correct for refraction. But more importantly, they're able to measure and deal with curvature even over distances of less than a single mile. And refraction simply does not occur at these distances. And having said that, the unit of distance known as the nautical mile is also a measurement of curvature, because it is literally based on the circumference of the Earth. 1 nautical mile is equal to 1 minute of latitude across the Earth's surface. But the distance between degrees of longitude isn't consistent because they converge towards the poles. But no matter what kind of measurements you bring to the table, Flat Earthers will automatically dismiss everything you have to say by reverting back to their claim that water seeks its own level and that it cannot bend or curve. And yet most real-world observations will show us that water doesn't really seem to give a damn about what Flat Earthers say it can or cannot do. Because here we have some examples of water bending, thanks to the magical powers of static electricity as well as magnetism. We also know that water always forms into a sphere in the absence of gravity, in order to minimize surface tension.
Realize this is the inverse system of what we just saw with the large sphere, where here we have a sphere of air surrounded by water. In the previous example, we saw a sphere of water surrounded by air.
Judging from the way Flat Earthers try to deny the effects of gravity on the Earth's oceans, it seems they have this strange idea that there's supposed to be some mysterious source of gravity beneath the globe that would pull everything off of it. And at the same time, they'll point to tiny, hollow balls that exert almost no gravity of their own and ask why things don't stick to it. They can't seem to wrap their heads around the fact that an object with a lot of mass does not exert the same amount of gravitation as an object with very little mass. And they want us to believe that since they don't understand it, nobody else can either. And so it must be fake.
How is it that gravity holds our bodies clung to the underside of a ball Earth, but yet we can easily raise our legs and arms, walk or jump, and feel no such constant downward pulling force?
If you're not screaming bullshit right now, then you're not paying attention. He just told us that when he jumps, nothing pulls him back down to the earth. Which means this motherfucker can fly. I somehow doubt that his yoga practice has taken him that far. So right now I'm issuing a public challenge for Eric Dubé to send us some proof of his magical levitation abilities. And how many push-ups can you do, Eric? If it weren't for gravity, you could do them all day long, but you wouldn't get much of a workout from it. Your body has to transform its stored energy into some kind of working force in order to counter the force that's constantly pulling it down. And your center of gravity is important for keeping your face off the ground when you're doing yoga. And nobody is clumped to the bottom of the ball, because there is no bottom. Up and down only exist in relation to a center of gravity, and would have no meaning to you if you were floating in space.
This magnetic-like attraction of massive objects gravity is purported to have can be found nowhere in the natural world. There is no example in nature of a massive sphere or any other shaped object, which, by virtue of its mass alone, causes smaller objects to stick to or orbit around it.
Actually, you can get a telescope and watch moons orbiting around other planets, and even observe their shadows passing over each other. Anyone can track comets and meteors using various apps and computer software, and these calculations are extremely accurate due to our knowledge of gravity.
There is nothing on Earth massive enough that it can be shown to cause even a dust bunny to stick to or orbit around it.
That's right, Eric. There is nothing massive enough to outperform the Earth's gravity. If you were to stand on a moon about 8 miles across, the amount of gravity it exerts on you is so small that you could easily achieve escape velocity by jumping with a running start. Although technically you wouldn't be able to run because the first step you take will send you flying off into space for a while. But if we were to try to replicate this on Earth with, say, an 8-mile wide bowling ball, its gravity would instantly be overpowered by the Earth's gravity, which is at least a few dozen times stronger. So there's no reason why anything would stick to it. We can observe smaller scale attractions by setting up a Cavendish experiment, which has 2 small, heavy weights suspended freely on a pole or rod, while 2 larger masses exert a gravitational pull on both ends. This isn't the most controlled experiment, and it's not very entertaining to watch, but we can use fancier devices like gravimeters and torsion balances to take more accurate measurements.
First, we weigh a small lead pyramid to measure the force of attraction between it and the Earth. Its weight is 152.166 grams. Now we move the heavy lead ball under the scale, adding its mass to the mass of the Earth. The weight has increased by 1/1000th of a gram, which represents the attraction between the pyramid and the ball. When the mass under the pyramid got bigger, the force of attraction did too.
By taking gravity measurements from airplanes, we can observe that dense mountains exert more gravitational pull than the oceans around them, which have less mass per volume and are slightly farther away. Density irregularities in the Earth can also distort the angles of plumb line measurements, which geodetic surveyors will then have to correct for. So yes, we can confirm gravity with simple observations here on Earth. Going back to the argument about water, I have to point out that water loves to stick to things. And in this example, we can see water sticking to the bottom of a curved wine glass. Now this is due to water's own electromagnetic properties and has nothing to do with gravity. But of course, these beads of water will eventually slide off the glass because of gravity.
Try spinning a wet tennis ball or any other spherical object with smaller things placed on its surface, and you will find that everything falls or flies off and nothing sticks to or orbits around it.
It still blows my mind that thousands of people are repeating this garbage, and yet none of them have actually bothered to test it or even think about it. We know that gravity increases with mass. So why would we expect a hollow object with almost no mass to attract water with the same strength as an object with an unbelievably large amount of mass? That makes no fucking sense. And yet virtually every flat earth believer has gaslighted themselves into accepting it without question. They also seem to think that the Earth's rotation is somehow comparable to the gravitron ride at the fair, and should send everyone flying off into space. So let's see what happens when we apply a bit of logic to that one. The Earth rotates only one time per day, literally half the speed of the hour hand on a clock. 1,000 miles per hour might seem fast when you're thinking about tiny tennis balls. But what does that really look like on a 25,000-mile circumference globe floating in the frictionless vacuum of space? Well, it kind of looks like this. This is a recording made from the Starry Night software that came with my telescope. And what you're seeing right now is the Earth's rotation in real time. Yes, this is moving at the correct speed. You'd have to stare at this animation for about an hour for it to make less than 1/25th of a single rotation. The spinning globe that we live on is not some out-of-control merry-go-round waiting to sling liquids everywhere like an R. Kelly sex tape. The outward centrifugal force of the Earth's rotation is incredibly small compared to the Earth's gravity. We know because we measured it. But if you still can't get your mind off of tennis balls, maybe this will help.
I'm pretty close, and it's not spraying on my phone, and it's not spraying my phonograph. Let's go to 45 RPMs. Okay, 45 RPMs, not doing a whole lot there. You see the water on the top there, it hasn't, it's not throwing water off this ball. Let's go to the higher setting, which is 78 RPMs. Alright. Wow. Okay.
Now again, these examples are demonstrating adhesion of water and not gravity. Without adhesion, we would still see the water being pulled down towards the Earth, rather than towards the insignificant gravity of a flat earther's tiny balls. Your inability to comprehend this simple fact does not mean that gravity is a lie. And our incomplete theories about where gravity originates from does not change the fact that the law of gravitation is an observable, testable, and repeatable fact of nature. But the reason flat earthers hold such a grudge against gravity is the fact that if the Earth was flat, gravity would automatically cause it to collapse back into a ball. So in order to keep their delusion going, flat earthers have to push their ad hoc fallacies yet another step further by telling us that gravity simply doesn't exist. They refuse to accept the fact that anyone can actually measure gravity with several different devices, and the way in which these measurements vary with geographic location proves that we live on a spinning globe.
How can we actually prove that? I'm just going to talk about that for a moment and just consider the fact that if we are actually on a spinning ball that is rotating like this, that is moving 1,040 miles per hour at the equator, there should be a measurable difference in the weight of objects when they are measured at the equator compared to when they are measured at a higher latitude. And by higher latitude, I mean higher south latitude value or higher north latitude value. And let's just take Perth, for example. If I measured the weight of an object in Perth, and then I measured the weight of it again in Singapore using the same set of scales, an accurate pair of the scales, and using exactly the same weight, there should be a noticeable difference. And that would be evidence, I won't say proof in this case, but that would be strong evidence that supports the fact that we're on a spinning ball. Now this set is accurate to 0.01 of a gram, that's 1/100th of a gram, and I also bought a standard calibration weight of 500 grams for this experiment. And the idea behind it is to measure the weight at different latitudes, and if the Earth is actually spinning, it should indicate less weight closer to the equator and more weight as we move further away from the equator, either north or south latitudes. Now, as I was reading the manual, I was quite surprised to see that they even talk about that. And the calibration of the scales has been performed at the factory. However, the weighing range can shift slightly during the shipping or due to changes in local acceleration of gravity around the world. If the scale begins to show inaccuracies, please perform calibration with a Smart Weigh 500 gram calibration weight not included. But that's what I've got, and I have calibrated now, and I'm at 32 south latitude, which is Perth, and it's calibrated for 500 grams. you'll see how precise that is. It's to 1/100th of a gram, and it's showing it just nice and accurately there. So as I move to a different location, different latitude, it should now show me a different weight. So I'm now in Canberra, Australia, which is a latitude of 35 degrees 18 minutes south. So it's more than 3 degrees further south than Perth was, and that's just looking out over Canberra Airport. Now if we put my weight on the scales, which were calibrated in Perth to exactly 500 grams, 500.00 grams, it should show a heavier weight here in Canberra because we're at a further south latitude, so we're getting less centrifugal force from the rotation of the Earth. So let's see if we can actually measure that. There you go, it's 0.16 of a gram heavier at a further south latitude. So the last sample I want to do is here in Broome, Australia, which is 17 degrees 56 minutes south latitude. That's my current location. Now, in theory, as we are closer to the equator, this standard weight on this set of scales, which I've not changed the calibration since the first time done in Perth, this weight should now appear less than 500 grams. So let's try it. Look at that, 499.44. So it's more than half a gram lighter because we're closer to the equator.
Since no sane person can argue that objects fall towards the ground, the Flatlanders have tried to push various alternative explanations for gravity that would work on their flat Earth model. All of them are hilariously wrong. First, they tried to claim that their supposedly motionless flat Earth actually accelerates upwards at the rate of 9.8 meters per second squared. It somehow accelerates infinitely without anyone ever feeling the slightest movement or observing any change in weight, and without disturbing the motions of all other heavenly bodies in the universe. This explanation was obviously so absurd that even the flat earthers decided to throw it away and move on to an even more absurd claim, which is the idea that gravity is nothing more than density and buoyancy. That's completely impossible and flies in the face of every experiment that's ever been done. But flat earthers will defend this indoctrinated belief with circular logic and baseless claims about how everyone else has been indoctrinated. And no matter how many ways you prove them wrong, they'll just keep spewing total nonsense. Density is simply the amount of space an object takes up, and has absolutely nothing to do with weight or motion, or any force that would cause an object to move towards the ground. A ton of iron and a ton of straw have vastly different densities because they take up different amounts of space, and yet they both weigh a ton. Density is an intensive property, in that increasing the amount of a substance does not increase its density at all. Rather, it increases its mass, and therefore its weight. This means that the effect of gravity is increasing even though its density is remaining exactly the same. You can also change the density of an object by subjecting it to changes in temperature and pressure, but doing so will not change the object's mass or weight. You can take liquid water and freeze it into a solid or boil it into a gas, and its density will be visibly different than what it was before. The atoms and molecules will obviously take up a different amount of space, but the same amount of atoms and molecules will still be present, and thus its overall weight will remain exactly the same. Gravity is completely independent from density, and only changes with mass and distance from another body of mass. No matter how you look at it, gravity and density are not the same thing, and without gravity, the property of buoyancy has no way to even exist. Flat earthers make the bizarre assertion that balloons and other floating objects somehow disprove gravity. But buoyancy is actually a result of gravity. So in an indirect way, gravity actually makes things move up as well as down. Any object that floats does so because the surrounding medium is basically carrying the object. And this results from the heavier medium being more eager to seek gravity. Air has more mass than helium, and will push a helium balloon out of the way in order to occupy a lower resting place, by basically squeezing upwards on the bottom surface of the balloon. evaporated water molecules ride on the drag force of the heavier air currents beneath them. But once enough vapor molecules condense together into heavier droplets, their collective mass will cause them to fall to the Earth as raindrops. A number of flat earthers have used density towers like this one to demonstrate how density and buoyancy work, while purposely ignoring the role that gravity is playing here. But a couple of college kids performed an experiment in microgravity on a zero-G plane to show us how this experiment falls apart in the absence of gravity.
We have F-72, water, and vegetable oil. And as soon as we hit zero, as soon as we go into microgravity, well, you'll see. Zero. Science! Hold it from the top next time, Jeff. Okay, that was pretty sweet.
That was a bit tough to see as John started to float away with the tower, but did you see the way it oozed? In conclusion, when we take away gravity, we take away up and down. With no sense of direction, neatly ordered systems like our density tower start acting all chaotic, with everything going in all directions.
Another pitiful attempt at debunking gravity is to claim that the downward motion of all objects is caused by the weight of the atmosphere. But that weight is still a result of gravity, and the entire concept of atmospheric pressure also disproves the flat Earth. In the absence of gravity, a gas will expand to take up the shape of whatever container it's placed in. If the Earth was a flat plane surrounded by a dome with no gravity, then free expansion would cause the air pressure to be evenly distributed all the way up to the very top of the dome. This means that the atmospheric pressure would be fairly equal from top to bottom. But if you try moving to a high enough altitude, you'll quickly learn that this is not how things work in real life. Climb a tall mountain and you will eventually begin to feel the effects of reduced oxygen and air pressure for yourself. And if you continue to a high enough altitude, these changes can eventually become fatal.
Though we are told that we have 15 pounds of atmosphere pressing on every square inch of our bodies, but this does not appear to be particularly logical, for there are many athletes who can leap nearly their own height and run a mile in less than 5 minutes, which they could not possibly do if they were thus handicapped.
Never underestimate the powers of the handicap.
I want you to take special note of the fact that he basically just told us there's no such thing as atmospheric pressure. But just a few minutes later, in the very same video, he does an about-face while attempting to explain away the influence of the moon's gravity on ocean tides.
By what means the tides are so regularly affected is at present only conjectured. Possibly it may be by atmospheric pressure on the waters of the great deep, and perhaps even the moon itself, as suggested by the late Dr. Robotham, may influence the atmosphere, increasing or diminishing its barometric pressure, and indirectly the rise and fall of Earth in the waters.
So, atmospheric pressure isn't real, and yet the moon exerts enough atmospheric pressure to push entire continents down into the oceans, without crushing us to death or noticeably affecting anything else on the surface of the planet. You can't sit there and tell me that gravity is some kind of magical made-up theory, and then turn around and replace it with an even more illogical and inconsistent magical bullshit hypothesis. Yet that's exactly what he's doing here. And this is the kind of dumb shit you end up believing when you try to learn physics from a New Age yoga instructor from Bangkok.
And Professor Bernstein, in his letters to the British Association, writes, "The theory that motions are produced through material attraction is absurd. Attributing such a power to mere matter, which is passive by nature, is a supreme illusion. It is a lovely and easy theory to satisfy any man's mind, but when the practical test comes, it falls all to pieces and becomes one of the most ridiculous theories to common sense and judgment ever conceived."
Really? You mean you can't think of any real-world examples of an inanimate object exerting force on another material object? Not one. Because I'm pretty sure that's what magnetism is. And this leads to another embarrassing attempt to disprove gravity. Some of them have tried to explain the Earth's magnetic field by comparing their planetary pancake to a giant ring magnet, with the North Pole in the center and the South Pole surrounding it in every direction. This is a bit like the magnets used in car speakers, but once again they offer no explanation for how such a configuration might naturally occur. To make things even more ridiculous, Eric Dubé has tried to support this idea by adding in some statements about an invisible magnetic mountain at the North Pole. He apparently doesn't understand that this legend was never meant to refer to an actual mountain. This is an alchemical formula encoded into a story, just like many of the stories in the Bible that don't make any sense when you try to interpret them literally. If you try to insist on a literal interpretation of this legend, then you must also believe that there are lions and dragons at the North Pole. And I think you'll have a pretty hard time proving that one.
Are you telling me they're out of dragons?
They never had dragons.
Who didn't?
The world. Get this guy out of here! Find me a dragon!
Furthermore, he conveniently neglects to mention that this legend actually refers to as many as 3 different Mount Meru locations, and one of them is thought to have been a reference to the South Pole, which automatically disagrees with any flat Earth associations. But even if we ignore all that mess, this ring magnet setup still fails on a number of levels because we know that the Earth's magnetic poles have actually moved over time, and they're still moving at about 10 to 15 kilometers per year. The Earth also experiences auroras in both the northern and southern hemispheres, which appear as an irregularly shaped oval centered over each magnetic pole. Flat Earthers can only pretend to address this issue by copying a few details from the Ball Earth model, and simply ignoring all the parts that they still haven't figured out, and probably never will. Other planets like Jupiter and Saturn supposedly have auroras at both poles as well. But of course the Flattards will cry that this is all NASA CGI. Yet even with an ordinary telescope, we can see that Mars has what looks like an ice cap on its own south pole, just like Earth. It's debatable whether or not a magnetic compass would work differently on a flat Earth, but various other kinds of compasses will only work on a globe. A gyro compass works based on the Earth's rotation, which is more useful than a magnetic compass when you're out at sea, because the hull of a ship and the magnetic devices on board will actually change the magnetic field. The gyro compass also has the added advantage of being able to detect true north rather than magnetic north. A flat, non-rotating Earth simply would not have a true north, because geographic north refers to the Earth's axis of rotation rather than its magnetic poles. These are frequently used in combination with a flux gate compass, which works by reading the horizontal component of the Earth's magnetic field, but avoids the problem of interference from the ship's hull by having a sensor placed outside the ship, usually at the top of the highest mast or antenna. These two compasses complement each other nicely, because the flux gate compass will often have trouble getting an accurate reading near either of the poles, where the magnetic field dips. Very few flat earthers have bothered trying to explain gravity as ordinary magnetism, but it's pretty entertaining to watch them try.
Now, if I'm sticking to the ground because of magnetism and I'm not made of metal, how does that work? Is this a magnetism that also strongly affects things that are non-metallic?
In your atoms and electrons.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean that I stick to a giant magnet in the way that a piece of metal does.
Like I've said, I'm not an expert. I don't think anyone is. We're just learning, I've been at this.
Well, no, but I think being able, if you say that we stick to the ground because of magnetism, but magnetism primarily affects metal, and we're not metal, that seems like a fairly big stumbling block to be addressed. Because then what you have to do is you have to say, well, there's a special kind of magnetism that affects everything that's not made of metal plus metal, and then that just sounds like another way of saying gravity.
Well, atoms have electrons that have attraction to one another.
Yes, of course, but I can still hold a magnet up to my hand and it doesn't stick. It just falls away, right?
Yeah.
The most recent and perhaps the most plausible theory that the Flattards have used to back up their failing model is the electric universe theory, which, as you can tell by the name, is also just a theory, because most academics still reject it. But this one at least makes sense and can actually be demonstrated.
So this is like
a little satellite going around a cylindrical-shaped planet. Except the physics here is a little bit different. It's not about gravitation. It's about charge forces. And, of course, charges can exert a potential field, as we call it, so it can exert a force at a distance with no tangible connection.
Now, so far, I only know of one actual researcher who decided to go the entire distance of saying that this theory replaces the standard model of gravity completely. But even that guy hates flat earthers. Most other EU proponents will simply tell you that both models of gravity are somewhat incomplete and need to be given equal consideration.
EU proponents do not claim that Newton was wrong. But for good reason, the electrical view emphasizes that gravity alone could never complete our understanding of celestial mechanics. There's no problem with gravity until or unless a gravity-centric dogma takes over, allowing theorists to overlook the effect of charge and charged particle movement at cosmic scales. Across the vastness of space, even the most minuscule and immeasurable electric field at any particular place can add up to a stupendous potential across the volume of interplanetary, interstellar, and intergalactic distances.
Regardless of what name you use for the downward force we experience on Earth, the observations still remain the same, and they all point to a globe Earth. We know that down exists only in relation to the center of our curved planet because a plumb line at one location is not perfectly parallel to a plumb line at a distant location. That pretty much debunks the entire flat Earth model, and I'm sure all of the major EU proponents will tell you exactly the same thing. In fact, the modern electric universe theory stems mostly from the work of the famous Nikola Tesla, who built all of his ideas and inventions upon the knowledge that the Earth is a spinning ball. The Flat Earth crowd apparently decided that they could portray him as a champion of Flat Earth physics simply because he had criticized Einstein's theory of relativity. And to do this, they cherry-picked and quote-mined a handful of his words out of the countless statements where he refers to the Earth as a sphere. In fact, several of his patents and many of his most popular ideas require the Earth to be a globe. So using his work to support the Flat Earth theory is just plain ignorant.
It's rather like a child who's playing with a tetherball. Tesla was so creative, he envisioned using his power transmitter to spank the ball, put a great big ball of electricity, by analogy, a pulse of electricity, in the ionosphere, and it would very weakly distribute itself all the way around the world. And when it came around the other side, just at the right moment, he would spank it again with another pulse of electricity, and he'd keep doing this until the accumulated energy was so great that it would be a resource to be pulled back out of the sky by a proper antenna.
Flattards were apparently so desperate to contest this point that one of them either altered or invented this quote attributed to Tesla to make it sound like he believed in a glass firmament over the Earth. The very last sentence here seems to be completely made up, because it doesn't fit in with the rest of the quote, and no one has been able to cite an actual source where Tesla said it. They did something similar with a quote that they attributed to Einstein, but actually came from Stuart Chase. And if you read the rest of the quote, you'll see that he was actually being a bit sarcastic, because all of these statements are false. Heavy bodies do not fall faster than light bodies, due to the laws of inertia. And boats made of iron obviously can float, due to the laws of buoyancy. What Einstein actually did say about common sense is that it's a collection of prejudices acquired by age 18. Both of these quotes are basically telling us that so-called common sense and our physical senses can sometimes lead us to the wrong conclusion. I'm sure Galileo would agree. The Flat Earth method of investigation, on the other hand, tells us to ignore logic and reason and to only trust our physical senses, which is precisely how stage magicians fool their audiences. Flat Earthers must also believe that women can be cut in half and put back together without surgery, and boats and mountains can levitate above the horizon because their eyes tell them so. Optical illusions exist, and they exist in nature, and if you don't understand how they work, then you're going to draw the wrong conclusions. This quickly becomes apparent when you begin studying the behavior of light. So we're going to move on to our next topic here, involving the sun and the moon. Flatheads believe that the sun and moon are both 32 miles wide and about 3,000 miles above the flat disk of the Earth. roughly the same distance as a drive across the continental U.S. The sun is some kind of magical spotlight, and the moon is a self-illuminating flat disk, perhaps a hologram or some other kind of etheric projection. Again, they offer no explanation for how it got there or how it works, and they don't believe in space or aliens, so I guess they simply think that God just made it that way. This claim seems to have been inspired by the Book of Enoch, but if you've ever bothered to read the whole thing, you'll realize that the author has no idea where the sun goes at nighttime. And earlier Jewish scriptures plainly state that the moon does indeed reflect the light of the sun. It's actually kind of hard to argue that point if you simply go outside and look at it.
You can see the blue of the sky through the crater. So it's obviously not something that's densely physical. You can see through it. You can't see opposite faces from different places. And if it was a ball can't reflect light either. The only way that the moon could reflect light like they say it is if it was a flat or a concave surface. A convex surface can't project light, reflected light, the way it's claiming that the moon does.
What are you, fucking stupid?
If the sun and moon were only 3,000 miles up, we would be able to see both of them 24 hours a day. We would never experience nighttime. The moon would have to be 100 times brighter just to be visible, and from various locations on the Earth, we would be able to see both sides of the moon, which is not possible in real life. Nobody has ever seen the backside of the moon from the face of the Earth, due to the fact that the moon's rotation is locked with the rotation of the Earth in such a way that we always see the same side. I guess this fact is just too much of a coincidence for the flat earthers to accept, and they try to make it seem even more unbelievable by distorting and misrepresenting it with phony computer models. The same thing they accuse NASA of doing. But we don't even need computer graphics to see how this works, because it can easily be observed elsewhere in the solar system. All the way back in 1671, using a primitive medieval telescope, astronomer Jean-Dominique Cassini discovered that Saturn's moon Iapetus was synchronously rotating with one hemisphere constantly facing Saturn, exactly the same way our moon rotates with the Earth. An interesting difference is that one half of Iapetus always faces the sun, while the other half remains in darkness. So from the surface of Saturn, the moon would look like a giant floating yin-yang symbol. But since we don't live on Saturn, we have the privilege of being able to see that Saturn and Iapetus are both spinning balls. And there's no logical reason to assume that our moon and planet are any different.
Get it, get it, get it, you just don't get it. Get it, get it, get it, stupid motherfucker, you stupid motherfucker, you stupid motherfucker. You stupid motherfucker, you stupid motherfucker, you stupid motherfucker. It's sunny now, it's sunny now, it's sunny now, it's sunny now, it's over your head, it's over your head, it's over your head, it's over your head, it's out of your reach, it's out of your reach, it's out of your reach, you stupid motherfucker, you stupid motherfucker, you stupid motherfucker. You stupid motherfucker, you stupid motherfucker, you stupid motherfucker.
There's also no working explanation for how eclipses can occur on a flat Earth, and their model would actually require the sun to sometimes pass in front of the moon, which has never been observed by anyone, anywhere, ever. That alone completely destroys the flat Earth model, and nobody has even attempted to address it. We can also see with our own eyes that the Earth's shadow on the moon is round, where the flat Earth model would require it to be either flat or dick-shaped. And even this could never occur, because the sun and moon would have to fly off the edges of the disk in order to cast any shadow at all. And if you still don't believe that shadow was caused by the Earth, then hopefully this will wake you up from your brainwashing. The typical flat Earth response about the eclipse problem is to claim that this can't be the Earth's shadow, because there are instances where a lunar eclipse occurs even when the sun and moon are both visible above the horizon at the same time. But the globe model has absolutely no problem accounting for that. It's a pretty well-known phenomena called a selenilion.
Here's one for the you don't see this every day files. A lunar eclipse after sunrise.
A lunar eclipse happens when the sun and moon are 180 degrees apart with the Earth in the middle.
During a lunar eclipse, the moon passes deep inside the shadow of our planet, a location that bathes the face of the moon in a coppery light.
Selenilion is observed due to atmospheric refraction. The view of the moon appears to be above the horizon for several minutes after it is set, while the light of the sun appears a few minutes before it has risen. If you're planning to observe the eclipse or the selenilion, it is advised that you choose a location away from the lights of the city and where the horizon isn't obscured by buildings, trees, or mountains.
Now, this just isn't possible on the flat Earth model. But Eric Dubé and others have tried to avoid defeat here by claiming that the shadow is instead being cast by the legendary Black Sun, spoken about in esoteric literature and Nazi lore. This is patently absurd because the term does not refer to an actual physical body in the sky. Just like his magnetic mountain argument, this is an alchemical reference to man's inner world, and not the outer physical world. They also offer no explanation for how or why this disk can remain transparent throughout the entire year, but then magically turn opaque just as it passes in front of the moon. And you have to wonder why we never see a lunar eclipse when the sun and moon form any other kind of angle with the Earth. So it's like this magical black object only exists whenever Flattards need it to. They're like, hey, it's black. We can get rid of it whenever we want. Bunch of fucking racists. Over and over again, flat earthers demand that we ignore logic and only trust our eyes. But every time our eyes testify that the Earth is round, they suddenly change their tune and tell you that you're being deceived by some kind of imaginary make-believe structure that nobody can see. This is called special pleading, and it's usually a good sign that your argument is shit. A more complicated problem is something called the moon terminator illusion. And I had to do some work on this one because I wasn't really satisfied with the way the Vsauce guy handled it.
A terminator is the line between an illuminated and dark side. Light arrives perpendicular to the terminator, but it doesn't always appear to. Maybe you've noticed this before. When the moon and the sun are up at the same time and a good distance apart in the sky, the direction the moon is being lit from won't always appear to line up with the position of the sun. What's going on here?
Some of the explanations that I came across kept dealing with all this talk about curved space and great circles and perspective issues that involve foreshortening and having to swivel your head around. But the only part that actually clicked for me was when they mentioned the fact that our eyes have no visual cues to help us determine how far away the sun and the moon are apart from each other. The sun is way bigger than the moon, and only appears to be the same size because it's much farther away. But without any visual cues to go by, our eyes can fall for a perspective illusion similar to this one.
In interpreting the visual image, the brain has to resolve ambiguities. And in doing so, it uses all sorts of assumptions, built-in assumptions about the world. And because it uses all these assumptions, which we can investigate in the laboratory and discover, you can also trick the visual system. And this is what you call a visual illusion. This is the M's room. It's a grotesquely deformed trapezoidal room. But the astonishing thing is, if you look inside the room looks completely normal, and the walls look parallel and everything seems fine. The reason is that the brain has a built-in assumption that the walls of rooms are usually parallel. This is something we've grown up with all our lives, and this assumption is so strong that it completely overrides the fact that the people are actually changing sizes. Even though in the real world, obviously people don't change sizes like balloons, here you're willing to see that because the assumption of parallel walls is much stronger.
This astronomy education website that I came across has an interactive animation that really helps put it all together. If you can focus on the bottom right picture, there you'll see an illustration of how the sun and moon would appear to someone standing on the globe. But what they're looking at is really the same thing as the big image here. And you can see how the sun's rays actually do line up with the moon perfectly. This means that the moon is only lit up by the side that's facing the sun. Always. And therefore, there's no logical reason to assume that the moon illuminates itself. The flat Earth model also fails to explain the shape of the dark and sunlit portions of the Earth between nighttime and daytime, and gives us no explanation for the changes of seasons. Rob Skiba tried overlaying the actual time frame of the sun's movements on top of a flat Earth map, and realized that the sun would have to speed up and slow down at odd intervals, while spiraling in and out with the changing of the seasons. No flat earther can point to a mechanism or law of physics that would explain how or why it would do this. But it's already explained perfectly on the globe model by the angled tilt of the Earth's axis. We can also tell that the Earth is spinning by the way the sun and moon remain relatively the same size throughout their entire journey across the sky. This is what you would expect to see on the round Earth model, where the sun and moon stay relatively the same distance from us due to orbital paths. But on the flat Earth model, the sun and moon should get larger or smaller as they approach or recede into the distance. I've seen a few flat Earth videos where the sun appears to be changing size, but that's simply due to the glare of the sunlight, which will disappear if you use a proper filter. Flatheads try to avoid this conclusion by running back to their fake law of perspective argument, but we've already debunked that one.
Also, the sun is too big to shrink to a dot anyway, right? And it's coming from a small sun. The sun is too big, coming from a small sun. Too big, small sun. Too big, small sun. Too big, small sun.
He needs more blankets and he needs less blankets.
I'm afraid you're right. I don't think P-Brain enjoyed my sense of humor there, but at least his name fits. And since the sun never sets on the flat Earth model, it should be impossible for shadows like this to occur. But we can go a step further by looking at amateur space balloon footage of a sunrise or sunset. Here you can plainly see that the curvature of the Earth is casting a shadow, and we know that this has nothing to do with any limitations of how far light can travel, because those same beams of light are still able to pass by at higher altitudes. There's absolutely nothing on the flat Earth model that could create shadows at this angle, yet it's perfectly explained by curvature on a spherical Earth. And you don't even need a space balloon to see how badly the flat Earth model of the sun fails. Because if you go out in your own backyard during certain hours of the morning or evening, you might be able to see a bit of sunlight striking the bottoms of clouds without striking the tops. This could only happen on a globe, and yet Flattards will claim the exact opposite just to see how much bullshit they can get you to swallow.
I saw the setup occurring in the cloud patterns from where I was, knowing that tonight would be very likely spectacular to illustrate the placement of the sun in the clouds. And that's also what I'm highlighting here. That can't be answered on a spinning globe model. And the reason for that is we're not on a spinning globe.
Are you fucking retarded? The hell's the matter with you?
On the flat Earth model, the sun remains hovering at a constant altitude of about 3,000 miles. Yet clouds only appear as high as about 8 miles up. It's geometrically impossible for this sun to light up the bottoms of these clouds because it can never be underneath them. And yet one clueless flat earther made the massive mistake of uploading a video that actually shows the sun going beneath the clouds, which resulted in his own flat earth followers begging him to take it down because he was embarrassing them. But instead of removing the video, dozens of other flat earthers began uploading similar footage with birds and airplanes allegedly disappearing behind the sun and the moon, as if this somehow proves the Earth is flat. It's astounding that these people think they can spot fake images in NASA videos, and yet they can't even comprehend simple contrast and exposure problems in their own footage. Either these people are joking, or they've reached a level of human stupidity that shouldn't even be possible. And then there's the claim that the angles of the sun's crepuscular rays are proof that the sun is much closer to the Earth than science says it is. But it's really just another example of flat earthers being fooled by their own senses. If we apply flat earth logic to this image, we would be forced to conclude that the sun is lower than the treetops. In this image, the sun is sitting in the center of these clouds. This image would have the sun placed just above the water. And in this image, the sun would literally be inside of the Earth. After listening to flat earthers try to argue this point, I'm fully convinced that they have a psychological need to dumb the world down into 2 dimensions because they don't have the mental capacity to think in 3 dimensions. I'll use P-Brain here as an example.
Okay, look at this picture. I put these rays in. Okay, so this is what's really going on, Wikipedia says. They say the rays are really parallel, and they would be from a million-mile diameter sun. But this is what our eyes do through perspective. It splays it out. Okay, here's another one. They say this is how they really are. They're vertical and they're parallel, but our eyes splay them out like this.
I don't even know where he's getting that claim, because that is absolutely not what Wikipedia says. It makes no mention whatsoever about vertical rays. So right off the bat, he's completely misrepresenting the globe Earth explanation to make it seem like it doesn't make sense, when in reality it's the only thing that makes sense. What Wikipedia actually says is that crepuscular rays are almost parallel. And if we had the ability to view them from overhead, we would see that this is the case. But the rays are actually angled downwards at an angle, so that the hot spots we see on the ground are far away from the sun, instead of directly underneath. From our perspective on Earth, the sun's rays appear to converge into a vanishing point long before they ever reach the sun. Just like how a set of railroad tracks appears to converge in the distance, even though we know that they continue to run parallel to each other. And even though these tracks appear to rise up to meet the horizon, this does not make us assume that the tracks are actually rising up vertically into the sky.
Okay, so then why doesn't perspective take these telephone poles and splay them out like this? We don't see that, do we? Why doesn't it take these buildings and splay them out like this? They're vertical and they're parallel.
Actually we do see that. But you're using bad computer graphics to misrepresent what's known as a 3-point perspective. When you stand parallel to a building off in the distance, it looks vertical because it is. But when you stand beneath that building and look up, you're now viewing it at an angle that's neither horizontal nor vertical, but somewhere between the two. So again, those rays are parallel, but they're angled towards you, not straight down towards the Earth. The only reason why the flat Earth argument might seem convincing is that the location of the hot spots on the ground tricks us into believing that the sun is directly overhead.
But this image here gives you the impression that if you got on a boat and you sailed out, that the sun would go from an angle of elevation of maybe, 45 degrees, and a few miles, it would just, a couple of miles or so, it would be directly over your head. And then you could sail on a little bit further and it would drop down to below elevation in the sky behind you. I mean, that's completely impossible. You never would see that. Say, for example, this one in Scotland, this is about 4,000 miles north of the equator. But it would give you the impression that the sun is directly below this point here. So it's giving you the impression that if you moved to over here, that the sun would be directly over your head. This one gives you the same sort of impression. If you went out to the sea somewhere, just maybe a mile or so out, the sun would be directly over your head. Same with this one here. Now, that's completely impossible, because the sun can't be directly overhead in Scotland. It can only be ever directly overhead as far north as the Tropic of Cancer. So therefore, what you're seeing here must be some kind of optical illusion.
We can clearly see in one part of the footage that the sun makes a hotspot on the Earth. The question this video poses is, if the sun is 93 million miles away from the Earth as claimed by modern astronomers, then how in the world is the sun creating a singular, circular, very clear hotspot on the Earth? The Flat Earth proponents explain this simply by saying the sun is not 93 million miles away. It is actually rather close, and so this phenomenon we see makes perfect sense. If the sun is 93 million miles away, then the rays that would reach the Earth would engulf the Earth equally and be parallel to one another, as shown in this graphic. Though I've looked fairly extensively for an answer to this anomaly by the globe Earth proponents, I've yet to find one that is personally satisfactory.
First of all, that video shows curvature. Second, I gave Marty Leeds the real explanation, and he responded by blocking me. And then he unblocked me to call me a coward while begging me to debate with him in a Skype conversation. And then he blocked me again when he couldn't counter my responses. But the hot spot that he's referring to is a reflective patch of water surrounded by non-reflective cloud cover. It looks like a hot spot because it just coincidentally forms a circle right below the sun. But if you look more closely, it's actually not below the sun. And you would know this if you had simply taken the time to watch the rest of the original video. Because as soon as the cloud cover changes, look what happens to your hot spot. It isn't shaped like a circle anymore, is it? And if we were to apply flat earth logic here, we would have to conclude that the sun is in two places at once in this image. And judging by this reflection, the sun must be shaped like a gigantic glowing space dildo. Specular reflections don't simply mirror things that are directly above them. And I guess I didn't fully realize how this works until I tried to demonstrate it for myself. I held this meditation ball just below this lamp in my room. And at first everything looked as I expected it to. The highlight on the ball is pretty much aligned with the lamp. But then I pulled the ball away so that the lamp is now several feet behind the ball. And the glare unexpectedly remained on the front side of the ball that's facing me, which almost seems to defy logic. It seems like the glare should be hidden from me due to where I'm standing, but it's not. The location in which a highlight appears is somewhat dependent upon the viewing angle of the person observing it. So to some extent, it actually is a kind of optical illusion. We can see the same effect happening when we stare at any reflection in a standing body of water, such as in these images, where the mountains that are being reflected in the lake are actually a good distance behind their reflections. And if we apply this observation to the sun and the earth, then it makes it much easier to understand that the sun is not directly above these lit up areas. Another major problem for flat earthers is the midnight sun in Antarctica. Flat earthers believe that the Antarctic is a giant ice wall holding in the rest of the Earth's waters like the upturned edges of a frozen pizza crust. And this wall circles around the outer circumference of the entire flat Earth map. Some of them believe that the edge of the disk is just beyond this ice wall, while others claim that the land extends almost indefinitely, making the Earth an infinite plane rather than a pancake. But given the way the sun is supposed to work on every flat Earth model, it would clearly be impossible for any point in the Antarctic to experience daylight for a full 24 hours. And yet there are plenty of videos of this happening, and one famous Flattard shot himself right in the foot by admitting to it.
One of the easiest ways to prove that also is the amount of time that it would get all-day sun or all-day night versus the North Pole. And we've got people who live near the North Pole, in Norway, in Alaska, in Canada, and those people can tell us what they see. And what they see does not match the opposite down in Antarctica, meaning if in the North Pole they're getting 4 months of full sun, then at that exact time the South Pole should be getting 4 months of full no sun. Doesn't happen. At the most, they get 6 weeks. So it simply means we don't live on a globe.
As I just said, the flat Earth model makes it absolutely impossible to experience even one full day of sunlight at any one location in the Antarctic. So by admitting that they get up to a full 6 weeks of it, Jeranism just proved that we do live on a globe. Flatheads all claim that the world's governments are hiding something beyond the ice wall, yet they can't seem to agree on what that something could be. They point to the Antarctic Treaty as evidence that the military is preventing us from exploring too far, because we might discover the dome or the edge of our mystical space pizza. And they cite Operation Fishbowl as evidence that they were trying to shatter this dome with nuclear weapons in order to escape. They seem to intentionally ignore the fact that the Antarctic Treaty now bans heavy military activity near the South Pole. And since I can't find any pictures of a massive military presence there, I'm wondering where exactly they think we would get enough manpower to patrol 80,000 miles of coastline. The fact is that tens of thousands of people visit the Antarctic every year. They've used compasses to confirm that there is a South Pole, and there are annual yacht races that travel around the entire Antarctic Circle. If the Earth was flat, surely someone would notice that they're constantly turning in the wrong direction, and all of the world's countries are farther away than they should be. But instead, it seems that everything keeps working out exactly the way the globe model predicts. And again, we can see what looks like an ice cap on the South Pole of Mars, And that brings us back around to the subject of astronomy, which gives us a number of huge problems for the flat Earth model. When I bought my first telescope, the instructions told me to perform a polar alignment with the North Celestial Pole Star, which is appropriately named Polaris. But it also mentions that people living far enough into the southern hemisphere might not be able to see Polaris, and will thus have to use the South Celestial Pole Star instead. That would be Sigma Octantis, and if the Earth was flat, then it simply could not exist. The fact that we can see all southern constellations revolving around a star that is not Polaris gives us irrefutable proof that we live on a globe. Because if the Earth was flat, you would have to either look down over the edge of the pancake or drill a hole through the center of the disk to look straight down through hell and see Sigma Octantis beneath us. Flat Earthers have tried to weasel their way around this one by either claiming that the southern star trails are just mirrored images of the northern star trails, which is easily debunked by just looking at them, or they claim that Sigma Octantis and all southern stars actually rotate around Polaris in a large sweeping circle. That completely contradicts everything that any human being has ever seen. Because if it were true, then southern star trails would look like straight horizontal lines going across the night sky. Nobody has ever shown any evidence of such a thing, and yet there are hundreds of videos and images that fit the globe model.
When you look to the south, in South America, in Southern Africa, or in Australia, you see the same clockwise spinning stars. Yet people in those three locations would be looking in three different directions when looking to the south. Yet somehow they see the same thing.
But if you see what we're doing here, we're taking these dome pieces and we're holding them up against a circling star pattern, and we're looking at Polaris and the northern stars. And if you look, and we start to kind of peer through the edge of that dome piece, we see another point of rotation. And guess what? It rotates the other direction. The only weird thing about it is it doesn't have a point that those stars are going around. But do the southern stars have a point that they go around? Nope. The reason why? Because there is no southern celestial pole. What we're looking at is the outer rim of the plane of stars circling above our head, in my opinion. Again, this is fun for everyone to try. You can get one of these, you can play with it, and I'm going to show you some more stuff I did. So the coolest part about this whole thing is that it kind of solves all those little problems in one fatal swoop. Because no matter where you're at on those three continents, and you're looking, all of you are looking south, you would all see the same stars. They would just be rendered differently for each person, which would be relative to where you're at in relation to the dome.
First of all, southern constellations bear no resemblance at all to northern ones, so they're definitely not reflections. Now second, curved mirrors warp and distort the image of the object being reflected in them, which means that most southern stars would end up looking like stretched out blobs of light smeared down from the southern sky, which we also don't see. And finally, if you look closely, you'll see that the star trails would have to swing around wildly each time you turn your head to look in a different direction. And he even stated this himself. Face the southeast, and you would see star trails bending one way. And then turn and look towards the southwest, and the stars will seem to move right along with you while bending in the opposite direction. You'll simply never be able to make this work on anything other than a globe. P-Brain recently attempted another new explanation that relies on comparing star trails to crepuscular and anti-crepuscular rays, which is kind of funny because here he actually admits that they converge at a distance instead of proving that the sun is close.
Okay, this is so simple, right? Let's take a look at these crepuscular rays, all right? Now, this is a non-convergent crepuscular ray picture. I just want you to see, okay, that's where you would, if I told you to look out at the end of that crepuscular ray, where would you expect it to be? You might point out there, and it'd say, no, it's not there, it's over here, it's converged. 12,000 miles from the sun, the ray has converged to a point. Okay, let's pretend that these are the stars rotating for a second around Polaris, and let's say Sigma Octantis is rotating 12,000 miles from the North Pole, and I want you to see that it's going to sweep across your entire field of view. In reality, but visually, you're not going to see that, because as we converge these lines the way they're supposed to be, they're going to all go to a point. Even though it's circling across your field of view, it's still going to be converged at one point, because it's 12,000 miles from the source, or 6,000 from the observer. Everything converges at that point. And so there you have Sigma Octantis sitting still all night long.
The glaring fault with this idea is that there is not just one vanishing point or center of convergence. As we saw earlier, any point in your visual field can be a convergence point. And P-Brain himself has admitted that the sun's rays will converge wherever the sun happens to be. But the sun obviously moves, and both the crepuscular and the anti-crepuscular rays move with it. Or rather, they depend on the relative location of the observer. Someone standing in Central America, for example, would see both convergence points in different directions than someone in North America. And the convergence points would also change positions as you move from sunrise to sunset. I think P-Brain would have to agree with me that far. But the Flat Earth model claims that Sigma Octantis is also moving. So why is he insisting that the convergence point stays in one place? It can't do that. Sigma Octantis would have to circle around to the rear of the observer over the course of 24 hours, which never happens. At the very least, he would have to see it travel from one side of his horizon to the other over the course of a typical night, because eventually it's going to be further away than Polaris. Yet P-Brain's own explanation is admitting that this will never happen, so he's completely contradicting himself. And if convergence was somehow magically able to make Sigma Octantis freeze in place, then why does the Southern Cross continue to move in circles around it in exactly the same way that the Big Dipper circles around Polaris? Circular star trails means that each of these stars are literally changing directions as they move. But they can't do that if they're attached to the side of a dome. They would have to move in the same direction all the time, period. A related issue that no flat earther seems to have even noticed is that the southern constellations slowly change positions in the sky as the months and seasons change. They seem to rise about 4 minutes earlier with each passing day. So it's not just the sun that rises and sets at different times with the changing of the seasons. And if all these other stars are also doing it, then that tells us that they are not attached to some rotating firmament. Unless the entire firmament also wobbles and changes speeds for no apparent reason. But even that would still be impossible because, contrary to what flat earthers claim, we also know that the constellations have actually changed shape over the years. These changes are incredibly slow, but an even bigger indication of this is what was once known as the precession of the equinox. Due to the slow gravity-induced wobble of the Earth's axis, the position of the Earth's geographic North Pole will gradually tilt and eventually point towards a new pole star, meaning that Polaris is not the only pole star we have had or will have. Back in 3000 BC, the North Pole star was Thuban in the constellation Draco, and in the first millennium BC, it was the star Kokub in the Little Dipper constellation. Vega was the pole star in 12,000 BC, and it will be so again around the year 14,000 AD. There have also been long in-between periods where there was no pole star at all, just empty space. In my next video, I'll go into detail about how several ancient cultures knew about this shift and encoded this information into various myths and allegorical symbols. There's also a little-known theory which is beginning to suggest that the Earth's equator may have once been in a different location. And in Mexico, people have actually observed that the Tropic of Cancer is moving slightly every year. As far as I know, there's no official Flat Earth response to any of this. They simply act as if it doesn't matter and go right back to making claims that don't fit with the facts.
So, it changes. I don't know where you get this idea that it doesn't from, but I find it really funny because you're going to mention that you've heard that it changes, and yet you never actually bother to delve into that. You just sort of say, hey, someone once told me it changes, and that's it. You don't actually go deeper into that, which you really should, because otherwise you come out looking like an idiot for not actually researching it.
That's a pretty long time. I remember hearing something, and I may be wrong, but I remember hearing something about the North Star changing. Anyway.
Typical flat earth behavior. Demand evidence and then ignore it. Then go back to regurgitating the same lies you've heard from a dozen poorly researched videos that pretend to support their faulty argument. If you haven't figured out yet that these guys are trolling, just look at how they answer the question of why we usually don't see stars in most space footage. But I'll warn you, this is probably going to hurt your brain.
That's why you can't see stars when you get out to space. They're not there. They are not there. Why can't you see the stars? There are none. Maybe up there it is. Infinite space. Infinite nothingness. There is nothing up there. That's why they never see it. Yeah? All the stars, all the planets, they're right above our heads, and they're tiny.
I know guys on crack that makes more sense than you.
So, they're right above our heads, and they're tiny, but they don't exist. How in the hell does that work? Are these Schrodinger stars?
It could be a couple of 100 miles up, a few 100 miles up. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You don't have to go measuring the flat Earth and all that stuff.
Even in amateur space balloon footage, we usually can't see any stars. But after a lot of looking around, I found one video that managed to capture some of them, along with a fancy meteor shower. You want to know how I got these stars? Well, I can't really tell you because the website was written in Spanish. But the official explanation for why stars don't show up in most space footage is that normal camera exposure usually isn't long enough, so they get drowned out by other light sources such as the sun, and in some cases by the light reflected by the moon and even the Earth itself. Now, having said that, I need to point out that this is the moon we see in the background of this video, and not the sun.
Starting with an exposure time of 1/1000th of a second, I got this very clear view of the moon, but no stars. As I gradually increase the exposure time, you see the first star barely appearing at about half a second. But as you can see, the moon is already getting overexposed. The more I increase the exposure time, the more you can see the stars. But look what happens to the moon. It gets more and more washed out. With an exposure time of 10 seconds, you can see the stars beautifully, but they start to streak across the sky a little bit due to the Earth's rotation, and the moon is just a bright smudge. Every picture you have ever seen of the brightly lit Earth or moon from space was taken with a fast shutter speed, which easily explains why you don't see the stars. Either you get the stars in the photo, or you get a clear picture of the bright object. You simply cannot get both in a single shot.
I also came across a few articles stating that you can even view stars in the daytime if you have a telescope with a strong enough lens. And if the sky is clear enough, it's also possible to see stars in the daytime during an eclipse. Although you'll need to be very careful about doing this if you don't want to damage your eyes. It's been stated that stars only twinkle when viewed from within the Earth's atmosphere, but in outer space they appear to shine steadily, just like planets. This is apparently due to the distance and angle of the starlight and the amount of our atmosphere that the light has to pass through to reach us. And I imagine this same scintillating effect might explain the curious observation of random distortions that appear when viewing the moon. Whenever a flat earther sees these, they automatically jump to the conclusion that the moon is just a phony hologram, despite the fact that it has direct effects on both human and plant biology. But getting back to the issue of stars,
the pitcher, steroid Santa Claus, kicks and deals. It's a long fly ball going back, and the ball shatters the sky, bringing the ocean itself down into the stadium. Oh, Simpson just broke this dream's reality wide open.
a few of the more religious flat earthers believe that the firmament mentioned in the Bible is literally referring to a giant glass dome, which separates the waters above from the waters below. Here again, we're probably dealing with metaphors and figurative language. but they interpret these statements to mean that so-called outer space is literally full of water. They insist that living on a giant pancake inside of a giant underwater aquarium somehow makes them more special in the eyes of God and grants them a greater purpose in life. And this greater purpose apparently consists of nothing more than indoctrinating more people into their own cultish flat earth beliefs. But they have another claim related to this concept that I've been intrigued by long before I had even heard of the flat earth theory. And that would be the idea that stars are somehow created by sonoluminescence. Just to give you a more colorful background on what sonoluminescence is, I had first heard about it after visiting a local IMAX aquarium one day while I was tripping balls on some psychedelic research chemicals, and ended up watching this deep-sea 3D movie at the adjacent theater. This experience would have been overwhelming enough, but what tripped me out the most was being introduced to the peacock mantis shrimp. This little guy is probably one of the neatest creatures on the planet. Not only does he have the most complex eyesight of any known animal, but he also has the amazing ability to use his front claws to generate a miniature fucking sun. A few of his close relatives shared this same ability, but the pistol shrimp has an even more unique way of pulling it off.
The pistol shrimp is no bigger than your finger, and it's a crack shot. One of its two claws functions just like a handgun. And other shrimp are targets. When prey is in range, the claw is cocked. The claw snaps shut so fast,
You got knocked the fuck out, man!
it fires a bubble bullet up to 62 miles an hour. The bubble bursts and stuns the prey. It all happens in a fraction of a second. The fastest gun in the sea.
Give me my goddamn money. The payback's a motherfucker, ain't it? Nigga? Pow!
It looked like a star in the heavens.
Seth Putterman called it the star in a jar, a tiny spot of bright light contained in a flask of liquid. This star in a jar is made when a sound wave is passed through a small bubble inside a flask of liquid. And this sound wave makes the bubble do something remarkable. First it expands, then it collapses. And this collapse happens so violently that vapor molecules trapped inside the bubble slam together and heat up so much that the bubble gives off an incredible burst of heat and light, several thousand times a second, giving the appearance of a star.
Long ago, I had read some New Age pseudoscience theories about how a similar process could have been involved in the formation of the universe. It's interesting that this process requires a sound wave and a spherical bubble, since many spiritual teachings refer to a word or seed syllable that somehow brought the world into manifestation. And the expanding and collapsing activity of a sonoluminescent bubble seems like it could parallel the concept of an expanding and collapsing universe. A number of metaphysical teachings poetically refer to this as the breath of the universe, or the heartbeat of God, suggesting the concept of a single creator dividing himself up into countless sentient beings, and then periodically returning to oneness, and perhaps repeating this cycle endlessly. Of course, none of that qualifies as science, so it doesn't really belong in this discussion. But here's another curious observation that the flat earthers have seized on. If you look at this image of the light produced by a collapsing sonoluminescent bubble, it actually bears a pretty striking resemblance to the horribly out-of-focus pictures of stars and planets that flat earthers love to throw around. This inspired both the flat earth and the concave earth believers to champion this idea as some kind of proof that science is lying to us about what stars are, and that somehow this means the earth is not round. That conclusion makes absolutely no sense, because this process seems to deal almost exclusively with spherical bubbles and spherical containers. So it's probably not going to produce flat stars or flat planets or a flat Earth. But the biggest blow to this theory's credibility comes from realizing that flat earthers also believe that planets look like this. Obviously, they don't. And this is yet another stunning example of the Dunning-Kruger effect. These images were taken with a Nikon P900 camera, which has a zoom function that's so powerful it can practically outperform a lot of cheap telescopes. But it still has its own limitations, and absolutely does not compare to more powerful telescopes, especially if you don't know how to focus it correctly. Flat earthers have the nerve to insist that even amateur photographs of round planets are part of NASA's globe conspiracy. This tells me that these flattards have never used a telescope in their lives, and yet they somehow believe themselves to be experts on the subject. This is the exact telescope that I bought for about $300. The strongest lens that came with it is about the same magnification as the P900. And if I use only those lenses, then the images that I see actually do look pretty close to what we saw in those flat earth memes. But if I were to slap on a few small upgrades and a Barlow lens, I'll end up getting some nice, voluptuous round planets like this one. You can watch them rotate, and perhaps even see their own moons orbiting around them and casting round shadows, which means that these things are not wandering stars or flat disks. The better your telescope, the more obvious this becomes, and you don't need to rely on NASA to see this for yourself. The simple act of owning and setting up a telescope should automatically lead you to one very simple proof that the Earth is round and spinning.
I posed a question to the flat earthers which none of them have ever answered correctly, and the link is down below. I asked them, why does if the Earth is a disk, why does my 30-year-old telescope have an equatorial mount that balances it according to the center of the planet? They could not answer it. They just could not answer it. They didn't even know what an equatorial mount was. This is what we're dealing with.
Olympus has stated that the stabilization of their cameras has reached its theoretical limits because the rotation of the Earth interferes with its gyrosensors. That alone seems to settle the issue, but flat earthers try to assert that gyroscopes won't work on a ball Earth. That claim is yet another absurd misrepresentation based on their ignorance of how they actually do work. They also point to Airy's failure in the Michelson-Morley experiments as evidence that no rotation has ever been detected. But it seems they keep telling this story completely backwards. What they actually failed to detect was the flow of ether around the planet. But when this experiment was revisited in 1926 with more accurate instruments, they finally made a successful measurement of the Earth's angular velocity. And thus we're now able to detect the Earth's spin using gyrometers and interferometers. And with a bit of additional equipment, you can supposedly detect it with the PlayStation Move controller. But the more immediate question that flat earthers won't let go of is, why can't we feel the Earth spinning? And why doesn't the ground move out from underneath the stationary helicopter if the Earth is spinning at over 1,000 miles per hour beneath it? The short and simple answer is conservation of momentum. This is a very basic law of physics that flat earthers will ignore whenever it proves them wrong. And yet it's a pretty undeniable part of our everyday experience. Without it, you wouldn't be able to fall asleep on an airplane while it's moving through the air at 500 miles per hour, because your body's inertia would send you smashing through the rear end of the plane. The same effect causes the atmosphere to more or less move along with the Earth's surface.
Gradually, friction drags the atmosphere to the speed of the surface. And from the geocentric viewpoint, the confetti at first appears to stand still.
But within that moving frame of reference, you can also have differential motion caused by other variables such as heat and air pressure.
Let's look at that again. At first, the water doesn't spin. It's pushed upwards while the Earth moves along under it. From on the Earth, it looks as if the wind is blowing over the surface. It's hard to know whether the air is rushing past us or we are speeding along below it. Usually, it's a bit of both. So due to inertia, winds coming from the poles are deflected. They end up spinning around the polar regions. For this reason, Antarctica has mainly easterly winds. It is the windiest place on Earth, while the equator is relatively calm and still.
The Coriolis Force shows that the Earth actually does move beneath a flying object, but this movement is so ridiculously small that it's pretty much negligible, until it accumulates within much larger systems. The subject is even more complicated than it sounds, but there's simply no justification for the Flat Earth claim that winds should be rushing past us at 1,000 miles per hour. There's no friction in the emptiness of space that would cause the air to move at a different speed than the Earth. So for most practical purposes, it seems as if the Earth isn't moving, because everything is moving with it. But the Flat Earth community managed to come up with another straw man experiment to convince themselves that this is just another lie.
Okay, so do you see when I throw this thing, does it keep traveling in a circle or does it go in a straight line from the point where I let go? If you spin a weight on a length of string, when you let go of the string, what happens? The weight will travel in a straight line. As you spin the weight and let go, the kinetic energy is released and the spin is severed. The laws of motion dictate that the weight will maintain its forward velocity. Try to keep this in mind when considering the flat Earth. Okay? This is a law of physics.
That's basically correct, although he left out the fact that gravity is still causing the path of the weight to slope down towards the ground. But whatever. This next part is where it gets fun.
International Flat Earth Research Society, I first documented the results of a study that I thought was very impressive about multiple cannons firing simultaneously, perfectly vertical. Now, this is what you should see on the spinning Earth. Remember the string. The ball is going to go straight when it's released from the spin, okay? So, the Earth traveling east at 1,000 miles per hour, the cannon is going to travel away from the point where it was fired. Okay, so just like the string, the spinning force is severed.
We can actually run an experiment on a cannon moving sideways and shooting a cannonball straight up. And we have, and this is what we get.
Gravity is still playing a tiny bit of a role in dragging the cannonball along with the Earth. But in this example, nothing is acting on the cannonball to cancel out its horizontal momentum to any significant degree. Maybe a bit of resistance from the wind and air pressure as it moves forward, but that's not going to do much to something as massive as a ball of iron. Regardless of whatever strings the Morgile thinks have been cut, an object has to stay in motion until something else acts upon it. And currently the motion of the cannonball is in the same direction as the motion of the Earth. The globe is so large and rotating so slowly that for all intents and purposes, we might as well say that the angle of momentum isn't really changing here. Even with what I've shown earlier, I bet you're still probably imagining that the Earth's rotation is a much bigger deal than it is. And I think we can understand this better if we take a look at the complete history of this experiment, which no flat earther will ever talk about. It seems this vertical cannon experiment was first recorded back in the late 1600s by two French observers who expected the cannonballs to travel westward due to the Earth's rotation. But they never actually found the cannonballs after they were fired. When they asked the famous Descartes for his opinion on what happened to them, he suggested that they may have actually gotten high enough to lose their weight and travel out into space, never to return. I somehow doubt their simple cannons actually had enough power to reach escape velocity. But according to what we now know about the law of conservation of areas, the ball should have fallen just a short distance to the west. The results of their experiment could also be due to the fact that it's extremely difficult to keep the cannon perfectly vertical while firing. I don't mind giving Morgile the benefit of the doubt by assuming that the proper controls were in place during the experiment that he was referring to. But unfortunately, there are no real videos of his experiment. We're obviously not going to get consistent results from a homemade potato cannon. But what I want to draw your attention to here is not the actual results of the experiment, but the results that they expected to see based on the actual calculations involved. The producer of this video apparently came up with an expected displacement of about 9 centimeters to the west. Only 9 centimeters. I'll discuss those calculations in just a minute.
Now, what you saw is how it should work, or what you should see on the spinning globe. Now, during the actual experiment that was done under controlled conditions, again, multiple cannons simultaneously, invariably, the ball landed within a couple of feet of the cannon that fired it. And in many cases, the ball landed directly back into the barrel of the cannon that fired it. Okay? So, you can talk to me all you want about you're a physics professor. I don't give a shit. You're a brainwashed physics professor, or whatever it is, you Ivy League, whatever. This proves, and you can't argue with this, that our Earth is not a spinning globe.
Did you see the difference between what we actually observe and what you think should happen? You can't even get reality right. That is how incompetent you are at physics. You don't even get reality correct.
People are still clinging to the false globe model in their brain, and they're going to try to argue this point with total nonsense. Total nonsense. I don't care what books you copy and paste from, what you copy and paste from. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't comprehend it. You're in a major state of denial, and you're never going to admit you're wrong until you break the programming. Now, you must concur with the laws of physics and valiantly admit that you were wrong. Period.
I think you need to try taking your own advice there, buddy, because the laws of physics are not on your side. When Galileo first tried to determine the deflection of falling objects due to the Earth's rotation, he predicted that an object dropped from 100 meters should be deflected by about 3 centimeters. But it turned out that this calculation was actually 50% too large. Carl Gauss later developed a better method of calculation, which eventually led to the development of Foucault's pendulum. About 50 years later, E.H. Hall used Gauss's theory to calculate that a ball dropped from 23 meters would deviate by about 1.8 millimeters. His experimental result was an average of 1.5 millimeters, but he also observed a consistent southward deviation of 0.05 of a millimeter, which wasn't predicted by Gauss's theory. It was at least another 40 years before it was finally discovered that this southern displacement was due to the Coriolis effect, although Robert Hooke had anticipated this result more than 300 years earlier. The Coriolis effect sometimes has to be factored in when dealing with long-range ballistics, and one of the most famous examples of this was the Paris gun, which the Germans used to bombard Paris during World War I, from a distance of about 75 miles away. Nowadays, most projectiles have electronic guidance systems and don't require any human help to correct for Coriolis. And Foucault's pendulum also demonstrates the Coriolis effect, by virtue of the fact that it rotates in opposite directions depending on whether it's placed in the northern or southern hemisphere. But again, the moment you bring any of this up in an argument with a flat earth fanatic, they're going to laugh and try their best to assure you that it doesn't actually work, even though we can demonstrate and measure it. They claim it can be debunked by the simple fact that toilets and sinks do not always swirl in opposite directions according to which hemisphere you live in. This is actually true, but only because the design of each individual sink or toilet adds in several variables that can change the direction of the swirl. When we set up a more controlled experiment to eliminate those variables, we see that the Coriolis effect does indeed exist.
But you can see what a tiny little effect it is and what extraordinary lengths I had to go to see this effect. So really, you're not going to see it in a bathtub and you're not going to see it in a sink or in a toilet because there are other sources of angular momentum that totally wash out this effect.
We just proved it because we just eliminated variables.
The Coriolis effect
is real.
It works!
And what is the explanation for this on a spinning globe? The whole thing is moving this direction. So why is it counterclockwise down here and clockwise up here? You know what, guys? This is a proof the Earth does not spin. This makes no sense at all. Why all of a sudden you pass an imaginary line at the center and then the wind would be the opposite direction. It makes no sense whatsoever. Have you ever seen science come up with an explanation why? There is no explanation why. Nothing different. There's nothing different between the North and the South.
You serious? That's so pathetic I don't even know what to say. If you have access to the internet and you can't find a logical explanation for the Coriolis effect, then you need adult supervision. You might even be due for a diaper change because you're just full of shit. Almost nobody can argue that the weather patterns that we see on Earth form into bands of alternating rotation, because we can observe this with simple radar technology, and we all know what tornadoes and hurricanes look like.
The engine of low-latitude atmospheric circulation is the Hadley cell. Convection occurs at the thermal equator. Poleward moving air is forced to descend. This produces two subtropical belts of high pressure, centered at about 30 degrees latitude. Surface winds spiral out from the subtropical highs, moving toward the equator as well as the mid-latitudes. Above 30 degrees latitude, wind patterns are more complex in a belt of conflict between polar and subtropical air known as the polar front.
These vortex patterns emerge out of a rotating frame of reference and don't magically appear in a stationary frame. And we know that the size and shape of these bands is consistent with the spherical Earth because we can see the exact same effect on other spherical planets.
Jupiter has many more cells than we have on Earth. There are at least 12.
And that's not just because it's bigger. The number of cells a planet has actually depends on how quickly it's rotating.
Earth rotates once every 24 hours. That's what defines a day. But Jupiter rotates roughly once every 10 hours, over twice as fast. And if Earth did the same, our weather would be very different.
The Coriolis effect also has a vertical component called the Eötvös effect, which refers to the fact that heavy ships and airplanes seem to experience slightly less gravity when traveling east than they do when traveling west. This is due to the outward centripetal force of the Earth's rotation, which cancels out just a tiny bit of gravity. Again, this makes such a ridiculously small difference that it's hardly noticeable. And yet we can actually observe the difference that these effects have by simply looking at the timetables for certain major airline flights. In fact, we already saw this earlier in one of Wolfie's videos. And while we're on the subject of airline flights, it doesn't take any kind of special knowledge to see that certain flight times and distances that we see in real life would be absolutely impossible if the Earth were flat. And you can point this out to a Flattard all day long, but they'll just end up moving the goalpost by pointing their finger at something else that they don't understand, such as this.
And look at this, right here you see the engines lose their efficiency. Look at all that smoke coming out. But this thing is going down now. To get back on point, a rocket launch should go straight up. It takes so much energy to get it there, and yet there is no footage that I have been able to find, that others have been able to find, of a rocket leaving our atmosphere, and it would not be that hard to film. Here's a rocket, supposedly has 2 astronauts in it, going to the fraudulent International Space Station, and what we see here is the rocket going back down.
Why in the hell would you send a rocket straight up? If you're trying to put something into orbit or achieve escape velocity, it obviously makes more sense to follow a curved flight path, because this will allow it to take advantage of the Eötvös effect as well as the momentum of the Earth's rotation. And this is precisely why most rocket launches are carried out near the equator. Count that as another fail for the Flat Earth believers. And this finally leads us into their arguments about satellites and space stations. Countless numbers of people have seen satellites and space stations through telescopes and binoculars, and even with the naked eye under certain conditions. And there are numerous apps and other software that can track these devices. But flat earthers claim that these are all either solar-powered drones or airplanes, and further add that any devices which rely on satellite data are actually working off of ground-based radio towers. But if you take a look at satellite dishes near the equator, you'll have no choice but to admit that these things are not pointing at radio towers. And their claim doesn't even begin to explain why cell phones stop working at certain altitudes, while satellite phones will continue to work. The most likely explanation for all this is that flat earthers don't know what the hell they're talking about. But then they ask why we never see any of these thousands of satellites in any NASA footage or space balloon footage. There are several easy answers for this, and the first is that the cameras are usually not pointing in the right direction to begin with. You'd almost have to be looking upwards to see them. But in the event that you actually do see a satellite, it's still going to be so far away that you'll probably mistake it for a star. To prove this and help give you a better idea of just how hard it is to see one, here's a video that actually managed to catch one being deployed. And you'll probably need to watch this in full screen mode just to see what I'm talking about. The first object that you can see here is presumably the upper stage of the Soyuz 2 rocket. And this itty-bitty little dot trailing behind it is another satellite that hitched a ride with it into orbit. Now that should be enough to silence the flat earth mob, but instead they'll probably claim that satellites shouldn't be able to survive the extreme temperatures of the thermosphere, because they've obviously never researched satellite cooling systems. In the vacuum of space, heat can be transferred and radiated away very quickly, and heat pipes allow them to do this without any power source whatsoever. And I don't really see any need to go into more detail about that. But another claim is that rockets and satellites shouldn't be able to generate thrust in the vacuum of space, because there's no atmosphere to push against. But as you probably guessed, I'm about to tell you that you don't need an atmosphere to push against. There are several different ways to generate thrust in a vacuum. I'm no rocket scientist, so I can only explain one or two of them, but that's really all we need. You first need to be aware that gunpowder and certain kinds of rocket fuel contain their own oxidizers, so they don't necessarily require oxygen from an atmosphere in order to burn. Now second, combustion results in an explosion of energy in all directions from a central point, so it doesn't need to push off from an atmosphere or any other surface in order to generate thrust. The center of an explosion itself acts as the thrusting block. The third point is that expelled gases don't need to push off the atmosphere either, because the moment you release a small amount of gas from a pressurized container, you're going to be left with an uneven distribution of pressure in favor of the direction opposite of the exhaust, which will create thrust and forward momentum. And once this forward thrust is in effect, the vacuum of space ensures that there will be no loss of speed due to wind drag or friction from the atmosphere. So the only thing it really needs to fight against is gravity. This next method is almost the same thing, but uses an object's inertia as a thrusting block.
So that's interesting. When she throws this ball out at 35 meters per second, which is pretty fast, she will recoil back at about 10 centimeters, roughly 10 centimeters per second. So she will recoil a lot slower, although she will move back. And if you think about it, this is a form of propulsion. This is how rockets work. They eject something that maybe has less mass but super fast, and that, since we have a conservation of momentum, it makes the rocket move in the other direction.
And there's one other method that I looked into, which involves
What?
And believe it or not, I only thought of this because I literally shit myself right at that exact moment as I was recording this narrative. And as soon as I stopped laughing at my sudden epiphany, I did some research to see if flatulence could actually provide a form of thrust in space. I soon learned that the astronauts on board the ISS have already tried this, and apparently the answer is no, it doesn't quite work. At least not without some minor technological enhancements. And if you still remember what we said earlier about free expansion of gases, you'll have a clue to this other lame flat Earth question, which is, how does our atmosphere stick to the Earth without getting sucked out into the vacuum of space? The obvious answer is gravity, but the reason this question is astoundingly stupid is because they're acting like the so-called vacuum of space works like their grandma's vacuum cleaner. Space does not suck. A vacuum does not pull. What a vacuum does is it allows things to expand freely within it. If you have this image in your head of a spaceship with its hull blown open and all the air escaping from it, you have to keep in mind that the ship was pressurized. and the ship does not have enough of its own gravity to counteract that outward pressure. So the air is being pushed out, not pulled. With the Earth, it's just the opposite. Gravity is pulling the air in, and all the outward forces are pretty weak. In fact, the Earth's gravity extends so far out into space that the International Space Station is still under the influence of about 90% of the Earth's gravity, even though it's orbiting us at an altitude of about 220 miles up. The astronauts on board only appear to be weightless because they're literally falling towards the Earth. But they also have enough forward velocity to make them basically miss hitting the Earth, at which point they immediately begin falling in a different direction, which leaves them in a state of constant free fall. Microgravity airplanes within the Earth's atmosphere can simulate this for a short period of time, but flat earthers choose to remain willfully ignorant about their limitations.
For the past several decades, NASA, together with Boeing, have been perfecting so-called zero-G planes and zero-G maneuvers, which are able to produce weightlessness at any altitude. Aboard modified Boeing 727s, specially trained pilots perform aerobatic maneuvers known as parabolas. Planes climb with a pitch angle of 45 degrees using engine thrust and elevator controls. Then, when maximum height is reached, the craft is pointed downward at high speed. The period of weightlessness begins while ascending and lasts all the way up and over the parabola until reaching a downward pitch angle of 30 degrees, at which point the maneuver is repeated. Therefore, all NASA's footage of astronauts aboard space shuttles or the International Space Station can be easily hoaxed and simulated in Earth atmosphere aboard a zero-G plane.
Eric has once again unwittingly disproved his own argument, because the diagram that he used plainly illustrates that the period of weightlessness on a so-called zero-G plane can only last for about 25 seconds. So this next clip that we're about to see poses a serious problem for his claim.
And I'd like to see them do-si-do each other really quickly, which they can't do, or they'd get all their wires tangled up.
Doesn't matter whether it's the floor or the ceiling. Every evening, after dinner and all the work was done, we always had to take a trip or two around the water ring lockers or just go up there and free fly.
We also found that we could have quite a bit of fun doing tricks and stunts and flips and rolls that weren't possible here on Earth.
Now, it's been promised for a long time that eventually we'll have commercial space flights, and then we'll no longer have to rely on word of mouth from NASA to hear about how all this space stuff works. But until then, it looks like we'll have to put up with the Flattards quote mining them and misinterpreting everything they do and say in order to make it look as if everything they're telling us is bullshit. The entire Flat Earth community is obsessively fixated on attacking NASA for this alleged conspiracy, and thereby discrediting any alleged photographs and videos of the Earth from space. Anything produced by any government space agency is immediately labeled as a lie, regardless of whether or not they can prove such a claim. Judging or rejecting something based solely on who or where it came from is known as a genetic fallacy, and history tells us that the globe model has been in use for at least as far back as 2,000 years before NASA even existed. They imagine that NASA steals our tax dollars while feeding us fake CGI images of space, implying that they're abusing us financially and laughing about it. But regardless of whether or not their space images are real, NASA's investments have drastically improved the economy in every state, and they've produced numerous inventions that have saved and improved countless human lives. The vast majority of flat Earth claims about NASA photographs seem to stem from their complete ignorance of advanced photography techniques and desperate attempts to willfully misinterpret what they're looking at. And in a few cases, some of their so-called evidence of fakery was actually faked by the flat earthers themselves. But even after combing through a never-ending list of logical fallacies, I still can't really blame the flat earth crowd for distrusting NASA. They are a government agency, after all, and it's absolutely true that they have an oddly occult history with connections to Nazis and Freemasons and other organizations of questionable intent. And there are a lot of folks, even outside of the flat earth cult, who have their own suspicions about NASA. I've talked with several people who claim to have had friends and associates who had worked for NASA, and even they seem to have their own serious doubts about the Apollo moon landings. I personally haven't seen any convincing evidence either way, but that's one conspiracy that I'm not even going to bother with. Because even if the moon landings were faked, it's still not going to change the fact that the Earth is a spinning ball. And the same goes for any alleged fakery from the ISS. But still, I'll admit that there have been a very small number of things that I haven't come up with a good explanation for.
If you're so smart, explain this, Clarissa.
Oh, did you see that? I mean, did this nigga just went invisible? I mean, is he Violet from The Incredibles? He has superpowers that makes him go invisible? Unlikely. Is he an alien? He's a secret race that can go invisible? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I don't know what the hell that was all about. As I stated from the beginning, there's absolutely nothing wrong with questioning these things, because that's how we find answers. But if you immediately start with the conclusion that everything is fake, and then attach the words flat earth to it, you're automatically going to discredit yourself. Because we know for certain that the earth is not flat. It's entirely possible that NASA could be hiding something out there. But whatever that something may be, it's certainly not the shape of the earth. Flat earth is never going to happen, and you're wasting your precious time even thinking about it, just like I've probably wasted my time making this video. But regardless, I already have 2 sequels that I may or may not take the time to finish up. So if you want to stick around for those, feel free to subscribe to my channel. Or don't, because I sincerely hope you can find something better to do with your time.
We don't have time for a meeting of the Flat Earth Society.
Wanted to die.
Sticking your head in the sand might make you feel safer, but it's not going to protect you from the coming storm.
The Earth isn't flat. And by the way, this is called gravity.
You got knocked the fuck out, man!